Today I'm going to share with you my process for painting this watercolor castle scene. First thing I do is I mix a really dark color. For this particular color, I mixed the green, the blue, the red, and the orange from this kit. I'll share the link in the description box. And then I use my round brush to paint this shape. It's kind of a flat plateau top mountain shape with jagged forest-like edges. You can see I'm kind of painting a outline first and then going back from painting the interior and then painting the exterior, the outer outline of this mountain shape. And then I use the tip of my brush to flick outwards to give it that tree branch jagged look. I usually paint from the bottom of the tree and then go steadily upwards and making sure to leave a little bit of white space where trees naturally have gaps between their leaves. And then I vary the types of trees and I vary the sizes too. So you can look at reference photos to get an idea of what you want it to look like. And then I start on the castle shape and I mixed a really diluted brown color. And to mix this type of brown, I think I used purple and yellow, but you can use any two opposite colors and blend them and they'll make a nice neutral brown color. And as you can see here, I'm doing a more architectural rectilinear shape for the castle. I strongly recommend looking at a few reference photos to get an idea of what you want your castle to look like. You can copy this shape or you can make it your own. And I'm using a smaller round brush for that. I'm adding a few triangular tops to the castle. And this will all get painted over with a darker color and will get blurred. So like this is just the base color and it's going to be the lightest towards the bottom of the castle. And I use a very small brush to get the tops of these castle spires nice and thin. And I only use a little bit of water on my brush and gently pull the paint upwards so that it's nice and straight. Then I use a little bit more of that dark color we used for the forest and I start adding a door. I get pretty loose with the architecture here because this is a really small notebook and we just kind of want the general suggestion of a castle without getting too in the weeds about making it look perfect. So I'm outlining some of the towers and I am painting like architectural elements coming in from the bottom, like straight thin lines. Eventually all of the roof areas and the spires and the turrets will have that dark color. So you can take your time kind of painting in these details. Again, looking at a reference photo would be really helpful. You got to make sure to leave some gaps towards that neutral brown color and then add some lines and architectural elements where you think they look appropriate. And then as I was painting these, I got my brush a little bit wet and then pulled that dark paint color downwards. It gave it a more three-dimensional, like kind of gothic look to it that I really liked, without losing any of the details that you can see in the castle. If you're struggling to get your brush point fine enough, then you can actually pinch it with your two fingers to get it really, really thin and get those details in there. So I did another layer trying to get those spires extra thin on top and then painting like little connections between some of the spires, like little crosses and stuff that I saw on some photos of castles, and then repainting over some of those darker architectural elements so that they stood out a little bit more. This is why I recommend everybody start with like a light layer because you can always darken it pretty easily, and like watercolor is made for layering, so just start out light and then add it as you go. And then I wanted to bring out some more tree areas and make some finer tree details, so I went ahead and did that along the edges. And I pulled out some of the more branches on the right and gave them a little bit more variety. Okay, so this is the rose part. So I mixed a diluted pink color that wasn't straight out of the tube. I use a little bit of green, which is the opposite color, to dull it a little bit. And then I paint these flower-like blobs. There's really nothing else I can call them. I'm keeping it really loose here because it's really hard to get petals and lots of details, but the important thing is to vary the darknesses of the flowers. Some of them are going to be lighter, some of them are going to be darker, and to vary the shapes and sizes as well. You can see I'm leaning my brush a little bit to the side, and then since I'm right-handed, and then painting with the tip of the brush like at an angle. That is helpful for me when I'm painting flowers. I tried to keep like some of the flower light in certain areas and then dark in certain areas to make it look like where the petals are falling. In most cases, that meant that the darkest part of the flower was on the far left side. Okay, so now I'm bringing that dark green color down, and then this is where I use a larger, rounder brush. And what I like to do is I paint around the flowers, and I use mostly a pretty wet brush here, and I paint really, really carefully, leaving little gaps around the flowers. Now, I'm working pretty quickly here, and I would recommend, if you can, work carefully and quickly. Obviously, that's the goal. But if you have to do it slowly, no big deal, because with cotton paper, it's pretty easy to bring that dark color back towards the flower, towards the interior of it, carefully in your second step. So yeah, I recommend, if you're a complete beginner, try this pretty slowly and carefully, and then you can kind of see how I'm doing this. Your paper will stay wet for a little bit. I have to lift it up with my finger like this so that I can get right towards the edge. Occasionally, you make mistakes, and that's, not a big deal. While it's still wet, you can lift it out. So, don't stress yourself out too much about it. Okay, so then I take a much smaller brush and I try to get in the outer part of the green field of color and bring it inwards. And I try to keep that color as consistent as I can. But actually, a little variety is totally natural and necessary. So usually what I focus on doing is the super dark green area is going to be way at the foreground, and then it's going to be slightly lighter as you go towards the horizon. But right now, since this foreground area is pretty uniform, I just focus on keeping it towards the green that we had at the beginning, and then carefully painting around those flowers. And as you can see, the paper is still wet. So I had to be really careful, and I use my fingertip to press it downwards so that I can get all of those angles. And there is a little part of the paper where my finger is pushing it down that's going to lift out, and that's okay. You can just repaint that at the end. So yeah, that's basically the whole process, and you just repeat it as carefully as you can. And some of the flowers might get a little bit smaller as you're doing this, which is, to be expected. So that's why I paint quite a few flowers. And then if you want to take any out, you can just cover them with green paint at the end. So yeah, you can give that a shot. And then right here on the far right edge, it was a little bit difficult because I got really close to the edge. But, once you're done painting in all those white gaps, you can spread the paint outwards back into the field of color, and it'll look pretty uniform. So yep, once we're finished with that, filling in all those little tiny gaps, then the next step is, for me, adding a little bit more detail in the flower area. So I have that darker pink color I originally made, and I add like little tiny lines and areas where petals will be. These are pretty, I would say, abstracted though, so they're not super realistic looking, but that's okay. It just gives the flower a little bit more dimension so that the viewer reads them as flowers. You can look at some reference photos of flowers to see kind of the shapes. These are like a rose flower, I would say, so they have kind of those rounded petal shapes where they're concentrated in the center, and then they fall outwards more towards the outside of the flower. And some of these are going to be buds and smaller flowers, so they're going to be just like where you see the outside of the flower, just like where the petals are more pressed inwards. So yeah, you just repeat that process through getting the flowers different shapes and different sizes. And you totally don't even have to do this if you don't want to, or if you don't have a small enough brush. If you don't have a small enough brush and you don't feel comfortable doing this, then I wouldn't try it, because it can get pretty frustrating if you're trying to paint some really tiny details and you just can't with a larger brush. So I always recommend artists try to get a round number 2 brush, or if you want, get an even smaller brush if you have like a little notebook like this, because it's really helpful to be able to have a brush available when you need to do smaller details, because it is super frustrating trying to paint small with a big brush. Okay, this is like one of the final steps. We are going to start painting some leaves. In the lighter and darker, you can see the lighter areas on the left side of the page are the ones where there was more water and less pigment. I start adding some leaf shapes, and those are basically really small, rounded triangular shapes here and there. You can see this is a better shot of me flicking my brush outwards away from the flowers to show where the darker leaves are. And if you painted your foreground too dark and you can't see the leaves, don't worry, there is a solution. You can use a totally clean wet brush and lift out some of that green area wherever you can and lighten that green up. I just get the paper a little bit wet and then use a paper towel to gently lift out the pigment. If you're afraid of it bleeding into your flowers, I totally understand. Another option is if you want to mix a little bit of white gouache in to make lighter leaves, you can totally do that as well. But you know, it's your painting, so you can personalize it however you like. So I'm adding a little bit more leaf details here as I go back into the background, and the larger leaves are going to be in the foreground closest to the viewer, and then they gradually get smaller as you head towards the horizon. I add a few more flower details, and that is basically it. Here is the final result of my mini Castle and Roses painting. I hope you enjoyed this process. Feel free to ask me any questions in the comments, and have a great day. You can follow and subscribe for more.